Well, welcome to this section of Christianity and Ethics. We've just begun to move into a discussion of the book by Michael Banner entitled Christian Ethics and Contemporary Moral Problems. And as I've introduced it, Michael Banner is a younger ethicist who teaches at King's College in England. And he is in the same school as Paul Ramsey and some of the people that we've already talked about. But he's a younger ethicist, and so he's dealing with some of the questions as they're put in our modern world. And last time I was dealing with the problem of the particularity of Christian ethics. Because one of the things, especially in a kind of a post-liberal, post-modernist discussion, one of the things that arises is that Christian theologians and Christian ethicists are becoming more bold to simply affirm the particularity of the Christian worldview and the particularity of Christian ethics. And so Michael Banner is interested in doing that. And in doing that, he looks back to such previous theologians as Karl Barth, and as we're going to see, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And these people were primarily people who were at their ascendancy during the 30s and during World War II. But in a sense, Banner is going back to them for some of the basic concepts upon which Christian ethics is built. Because in the last few decades, many times Christian ethics and Christian theology, from Banner's perspective, has just kind of become a little hazy and fluid and hasn't been able to actually present a strong Christian perspective on what the world is, what a human being is, and so forth. And that expresses itself in a lot of the confusion that goes on in discussions of things like ecology, environmentalism, the problem of the beginning and the end of life, that is abortion and euthanasia, and so forth. So if you're going to do ethics of any kind today, you have to do these subjects. Our goal in this course is to show how you can do them from a Christian perspective. Now, I need to make a kind of a little housekeeping apology here. Last time, I thought I had some pretty good things to say, but at the same time, I was undergoing a kind of an allergic reaction, and when that happens, my nose like fire. And if you noticed last time, I was trying to keep my nose settled down while I was talking. Now, I never promised to be pretty, so I can't do that. But it might help you to go back and look at the tape again and listen without looking, because that was probably a little distracting. I'll try to not do that this time. But looking back at where we ended last time, if we'll look at the screen, according to this way of thinking, that is, according to the way of thinking that has been discussed using primarily Karl Barth, K-A-R-L-B-A-R-T-H, who is a theologian who's generally considered to be the greatest 20th century theologian of the Protestant side. But even though he's still generally considered to be the greatest 20th century theologian, he is still kind of considered passé by a great many younger theologians that grew up after Barth. And even though you may have been greatly influenced by Barth, some of the people who are greatly influenced by Barth may never even have read him. And so many times all they have is negative cliches about what Barth believes. And so it's interesting that some of the even younger theologians and ethicists of the present time are going back to Barth and recognizing that although you can't be a complete Barthian any more than you can go back and be a complete Lutheran or a complete Calvinist, you can still recognize the importance of Barth. And a lot of these young ethicists and theologians are considering Barth to be the first post-modernist Christian theologian. That is, he anticipated what was going to be happening, maybe not predicting it, but anticipated what was going to be happening at the end of the 20th century, when postmodernism was going to kind of eat away at the great liberal modernist synthesis in which people assumed that we had now kind of arrived at a great consensus about the nature of the world and the nature of religion and so forth. And that all began to fall apart at the end of the 20th century. So now there are a lot of voices out there vying for a hearing. And so from Banner's perspective, from the perspective of Karl Barth, Christian theologians should not be ashamed of trying to put forward their perspective. And since from their perspective, theology and ethics cannot be divided, then if you're going to do Christian ethics, you have to do it from the perspective of the action of God and from the perspective of Jesus Christ. So again, on the screen, according to this way of thinking, the task of Christian ethics lies in the description of human action called forth by the reality of the action of God. And we saw that all the way through Ramsey. Christians can't do anything. They can't know what to do unless they know who God is and what God has done. And this is what dogmatics or theology or theological ethics bears witness to. So Barth's account begins from the assertion that it is only in the concept of the covenant that the concept of God can itself find completion. Why? Because God is not known and is not knowable except in Jesus Christ. Now that has been a perennial Christian affirmation. Most Christian theologians still assume that if you're going to continue to call yourself a Christian, it must be because in some way or another you consider Jesus Christ to be the center of your understanding of the world, your understanding of God, your understanding of human beings, and therefore your understanding of how ethics should be developed. Now, we've also talked about this being a particularity, which it is. And sometimes people confuse a particularity with a bigotry or with an exclusiveness, an ill-advised exclusiveness, because one of the great moral principles in our culture is the principle of tolerance. Well, tolerance can mean different things. From the perspective of Christian ethics, tolerance can mean that Christians should at least be tolerant of all other human beings' religious perspectives, all other human beings' lifestyles. That is, Christians have no right, based on their own Christian perspective, to be intolerant of anybody. And so bigotry, in the sense of speaking or acting in a way that is detrimental to someone else because they do not hold the same view of Jesus Christ or the same view of God as Christians, from the perspective of Christian ethics, is wholly ruled out. And that's on the basis not only of modern theologians, but that's on the basis of Paul. Paul makes clear that righteousness, self-righteousness, is entirely ruled out by the Christian gospel. And so when Paul or any other Christian theologian who from my perspective understands what he's saying, when Paul or any other Christian theologian like Barth or Bonhoeffer say that Christian thought is centered in Jesus Christ, he's not therefore making some kind of ultimate judgment as to the damnation or salvation of anybody else. It's simply the fact that from the Christian perspective, since Christians are monotheists, what does that mean? They believe there's only one God. If a person believes there's only one God, even for the sake of dialogue with other religions, he can't just say, well, I'm just going to bracket that belief. I'm just going to give up that belief in order to show my tolerance. That is not dialogue. Dialogue is when you go into a conversation with another religious perspective and you know what your religious perspective is and you don't give it up just for the sake of tolerance or dialogue. You are tolerant and you want to participate in dialogue, but that does not require giving up the central understanding of your faith. And so for Christians, that means Christians generally understand that they cannot give up their belief that God is not known and is not knowable except in Jesus Christ. But what does that mean? I introduced you last time to Paul's discussion of this subject in the New Testament in the book of Romans. Paul in the book of Romans, in the first several chapters, is discussing his interpretation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of Jesus Christ. And there's no doubt that from his perspective, Jesus Christ, to know Jesus Christ is to know the one true God. That doesn't mean that you identify the man Jesus Christ completely with God, but that through Jesus Christ you know the one true God. As John, the Gospel of John puts it, if you know me, you know the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So that's no more intolerant than monotheism is. If there is only one God and he extends his salvation to people, and the gospel is the proclamation of how he extends his salvation to people, then the center of the gospel, or the center of the Christian message, is Jesus Christ. And so a Christian cannot interpret any issue outside of the light of Jesus Christ, primarily his death, his burial, and his resurrection. So anytime Paul discusses any ethical issue, how to treat your brother in the church, what to do about your daily life, what you should eat and the way you should live, how you should handle your marriage, how you should handle your sexuality. From Paul's perspective, a Christian always has to go back to Jesus Christ in order to understand that. For instance, how should a man treat his wife? Well, Paul doesn't just say, well, treat her nice, because it depends on what your conception of nice is as to how that means you're going to treat your wife. What does he say? He says you should love your wife as Christ loved the church. Well, that gives you a little bit more homework, you understand? That means you have to go back and try to figure out, or try to understand how Christ loved the church. And only after you've figured something about that out, you can never figure it all out. You can never comprehend it completely. But once you've tried to comprehend how much Christ loved the church, then that is your ethical directive for how you're to treat your wife. That's just one example. You can talk about how parents are supposed to treat their children, how children are supposed to treat their parents, how people who have somebody working for them are supposed to treat them, how somebody who is working for another person is supposed to treat them, how is a Christian supposed to treat the emperor or the president. The New Testament talks about all of this, and it's always in terms of how God has treated you in Jesus Christ. So you can't just say, treat the president with respect. What does that mean if you're a Christian? Or treat your wife nice. What does that mean if you're a Christian? Or treat your children right. What does that mean if you're a Christian? That has a particular content. So that's the reason why, from these guys' perspective, dogmatics or theology is central to the discussion of what we're talking about. Now, when Paul got through explaining, while Paul was trying to explain that salvation is only through Jesus Christ, what I told you last time is very important, and I'll repeat it again. He chooses as an example of a person who is saved by God through his grace in Jesus Christ. In other words, from Paul's perspective, we're saved by God. We're saved by the grace of God that's shown to us in Jesus Christ. So who does he choose as an example? It's really, it seems to me, a very deliberate choice, because Paul could have chosen some Christian that he knew. For instance, Paul could have chosen the Apostle Peter. The Apostle Peter was a very important character in the early church. Why didn't Paul choose the Apostle Peter as an example of somebody who was saved by grace through faith? Well, I think that one of the reasons why he didn't is because Peter was both a Jew and a Christian. Instead, he chose a man who is neither a Jew nor a Christian. And he says, this is the kind of a person. This is the person who has been saved by Jesus Christ. And who was that man he chose? Abraham. It's very helpful for modern Christians and other people to understand, especially when we try to help relations between Christians and Jews and Muslims and Christians, is that Abraham is not a Jew and he was not a Christian. And yet he is the spiritual ancestor of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And what Paul is saying here is that Abraham is the spiritual ancestor of Christians, just as much as he's the spiritual ancestor of Jews. And if he's the spiritual ancestor of Christians, then from the Christian perspective, he is saved by the same God as the Jews were saved by. And the Jews are saved by the same God that Abraham is saved by. And the followers of Jesus are saved by the same God that Abraham was saved by, and so on. Abraham, in other words, is an example of a person who is saved by the grace of God through Jesus Christ. Now, you'll notice that since Abraham is a Christian, he could not go around saying, I am saved by Jesus Christ. He's not a Christian. He's never heard of Jesus Christ. So the question is not whether Abraham had ever heard of Jesus Christ, or whether Abraham had ever been a Christian, or even whether Abraham had ever been a Jew. The question is, was Abraham saved by Jesus Christ? Anybody before Abraham who had not been introduced to Yahweh, the God who revealed himself to Abraham, and the God who introduces himself to Moses. God introduces himself to Moses as Yahweh. Does that mean that before God introduced himself to Moses and Moses said, I am a son or a child of Yahweh, that nobody in all history had ever been saved? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that anybody in all history who has been saved by Yahweh. Because there's no other God to save them. Moloch can't save you. None of these other gods can save you. And so what I'm trying to get us to understand is that the affirmation that salvation only comes through Jesus Christ is an inescapable affirmation if you're a Christian. But it is not an intolerant affirmation. It's not a bigoted affirmation. It's an affirmation that salvation has come from God. And that salvation has come from God through Jesus Christ. Now, how everybody in the world is related to God, that's up to God. But the Christian belief, and you can consider this bigoted or particular or whatever, but the Christian belief is that anyone who is saved by Jesus Christ, whether he's ever heard of Jesus Christ or not. And so the best way to understand our salvation is by understanding what God has done through Jesus Christ. Theology does not save anybody. So if I have a better understanding of God than you do, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saved better than you are. Or if you have a better understanding of God than I do, that does not mean that you are saved any better than I am. We're both saved by the same God, however ignorant or understanding we are of the nature of that God. So the Christian affirmation is simply that the full revelation of God is in Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean that everybody has to understand the full revelation of God in order for God to save them, because the full revelation of God that comes through Jesus Christ is that we're saved by the love and grace of God, not by our own actions. In other words, nobody is saved by being a Christian. Nobody was saved by being a Jew. We're saved by the love of God. And that salvation love is reciprocated to a certain extent by our faith in God. That's the only way you can understand that Abraham was saved because of his faith in Jesus Christ. And that's the only way you can understand the possibility that Christians, to a large part, extend to people who are not Christians. Even the Vatican which represents the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church and is generally considered to be extremely conservative theologically in terms of Christian thought. But the Pope has been trying to say in many ways over the last few decades that Christians have a kind of a double responsibility. They have the responsibility of affirming the oneness of God. In other words, the church cannot get up in the morning and announce, well, we believe that there's one God, but there may be 20. Can't do that. Every time they get up, they're supposed to affirm, we believe in one God. So is a Jew supposed to do that. So in the same way, the church cannot get up one morning and say, we believe in Jesus Christ, but we believe that he is just one way among many by which people can be saved. Because that's the same thing as saying that that God is just one God among many, whereby you can be saved. But that's the first responsibility, to maintain the particularity of the Christian faith, because that's how God comes to us, according to Judaism and Christianity, is through the particularity of being chosen and being covenanted with. But on the other hand, the Pope makes no statements. You know, some popes may have made these statements in the past, but the present Pope would make no statement leaving people with the impression that because a person is a Buddhist or Hindu that they're going to hell. That is not the job of the church. So the job of the church is twofold. It's to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and the particularity of God's grace, the particularity of God, the particularity of his grace, the particularity in Jesus Christ. Obviously, a Christian does not expect a Jew who is true to his Jewish faith to affirm the particularity of Jesus Christ. But he also does not expect a Jew to forbid a Christian to affirm that particularity, any more than a Hindu should forbid a Jew from affirming his particularity of one God. Because a Jew is supposed to confess, I believe in one God. Now, is that bigotry? Is that exclusiveness? No. God is the most inclusive idea in the world. Yeah.
So, like in the Jewish and Muslim faith, they believe in God, and they know that Jesus died. But do they think he's an apostle, or what do they think he is?
Well, that's an interesting study, and we can't go into it into much depth. But I think that's apropos to our question, because among the world's religions, there are actually two large subsets. The kind of liberal syrup that says all religions say the same thing and all religions believe the same thing, that's not showing respect to anybody's religion. It's not showing respect to a Buddhist to tell him that his religion and the Christian religion are all the same thing, it doesn't make any difference. That's just kind of intellectual nonsense. But there are two large subsets of religion, probably more than that, but when we talk about world religions, there are two large subsets. One is the Asian religion, which tends toward pantheism, or in the case of Buddhism, kind of a mystical atheism, in which God is everything that is. The other subset is what we call monotheism. That is the belief not that God is everything there is, but that there is only one God, and that he has created everything else there is. Now, there are three major religions in this other subset. You can talk about some minor religions that are in this subset too. But the three major religions in this subset, that is the monotheistic subset, are Judaism, which is the oldest of this group, Christianity, which is the second oldest, and Islam, which is historically the third oldest. Now, the thing about all three of these religions is that they all claim to worship the same God. And there's no use going around telling a Muslim or a Jew, no use a Christian going around telling a Muslim and a Jew, you're not really worshiping God, because that is an arrogant thing to say. If there's only one God, then if you're worshiping, you're worshiping Him. And so generally Christians, Jews, and Muslims do not deny that the others are worshiping the true God. But obviously their historical background means that they will have somewhat different concepts of who God is, and somewhat different concepts of how He's revealed Himself. For instance, Muslims believe that God has revealed Himself through Abraham, through Moses, through Jesus Christ, and through Muhammad. So if you're just looking for the religion that is the most inclusive, in a sense, it might be Islam, even though in other ways Islam is much more exclusive than Judaism or Christianity. But if you're just looking for a religion that emphasizes the importance of all of these people, the Muslims call all these people prophets. So they will tell you that they believe in Jesus Christ. They don't mean the same thing by that as Christians do. But they do believe in Jesus Christ. That is, they believe that Jesus Christ was born. In fact, they believe that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. The interesting thing about that is that a higher percentage of Muslims believe in the literal virgin of Christ than Christians. You know, since the rise of liberalism and modernism in Christianity, there are lots of Christians who believe in Jesus, but they don't believe in the literal virgin birth. So that's one of the ironies of modern history, is that there's a higher percentage of Muslims who believe in the literal virgin birth than Christians. So they believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. They do not believe He was crucified, because the concept of the crucifixion simply does not fit their theology of God. Because their conception of God's grace is different from the conception of Christianity, and their conception of the nature of man and his sinfulness is different from Christianity. They do believe that human beings are sinners, and they do believe that God has to save any human beings who are saved, and they do believe that anybody who is not saved will go to hell. But they don't believe that salvation is the same thing as what Christians believe. And that's a whole very difficult subject to go into. And some Muslims believe that Jesus is coming again, just like Christians do. That in some way Jesus was a Messiah figure who will come again. That's not necessarily universal, but some Muslims believe that. That means that Muslims sometimes pay more attention to Jesus than some Christians do. And so when Christians do not understand the respect that Muslims have for Jesus, then they misunderstand Muslims. And Muslims are very sensitive on this issue, because they think some Christians leave them with the impression that Christians don't think the Muslims know anything about Jesus. When Jesus is spoken of in the Quran, the mother of Jesus is spoken of in the Quran, he is considered to be a great prophet. Muhammad simply is considered to be the final prophet, not necessarily superseding Jesus, but the final prophet. Because from the Muslim perspective, what Muhammad tells you is God's will is the same thing that Jesus told you, which is the same thing that Moses told you, which is the same thing that Abraham told us. Now, when Christians and Jews read their Bible, it doesn't sound to them like the same thing that Muhammad says. But the Mohammedan view is that Jesus did say the same thing as Muhammad. Moses did say the same thing as Muhammad. But their religions have been corrupted over the years, so Muhammad came to kind of purify a religion. So from the perspective of a Muslim, everyone who is born a Muslim, because the word Muslim simply means one who submits to God. And you only cease becoming a Muslim as a choice later in your life. Now that seems kind of like an odd belief to Christians, but it is very consistent with Muslim theology, because Muslim theology is a universalist faith. It believes in one God, So it believes all human beings, whether they're Arabs or Texas Baptists, are created by the same God. And if they're going to go to heaven, they're going to be taken there by the same God. And so in a sense, that makes Islam a very universalistic faith. But it is still very particularistic in that it believes that the final revelation comes through Muhammad. Well, Christians cannot. Christians can fail to believe that. In fact, if you are a Christian, you probably will not believe that Muhammad is the final revelation. If you are a Christian, you will assume that Jesus Christ is the final revelation. But in order to have a dialogue with a Muslim, I'm not going to go tell him now, in order to have a dialogue with me, you're going to have to give up the idea that Muhammad is the final revelation. That wouldn't be a dialogue. That would be religious imperialism. Okay, then Jews, of course, also consider themselves to be descendants of Abraham, spiritually. Even though Abraham was not a Jew, he was not an Israelite, these are words that come later on. And a lot of the descendants of Abraham are not Jews or Israelites. The Jewish perspective is that God revealed himself by his making a covenant relationship with Abraham and then making a covenant relationship with Israel through Moses. Well, Christians believe the same thing. In other words, the Jewish Bible is part of the Christian Bible. So Christians believe that God made a covenant with Abraham. Christians believe that God made a covenant with Moses. Where Christians and Jews part is at the coming of Jesus Christ, because the Christians affirm that Jesus of Nazareth was the Jewish Messiah through whom God has made a covenant not only with the Jews but with the nations, that is, with the Gentiles. So the difference between a Jew and a Christian, the basic difference between a Jew and a Christian, is that a Christian believes that Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish person who was born a Jew and died a Jew, was also the Messiah of God who established a covenant relationship not only with Jews but for everybody. And Jews are people who do not accept that Jesus was the Messiah of the Jews. And that's the basic difference. All of the other differences that have developed through history, that have made us almost enemies sometimes, are really almost irrelevant to the basic faith of Judaism and Christianity. So, that means that Jews and Christians particularly should in some way reflect that they may be two different religious expressions, but in some very profound sense, they are expressions of the same faith. In other words, they have the same God. The God of Jesus Christ is the God of Moses, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob. Yes?
So in John 3:16, where it says, "For God so loved the world," it says, for whosoever believed him, should have everlasting life. So does that mean that Jewish people won't be going to heaven because they don't believe that God is the Messiah?
No, that's what I'm saying. The New Testament does not determine that. When Jesus said that, for instance, the only people he was talking to were Jewish people. So there's no doubt that the New Testament preachers preached the gospel or